Hi everybody, welcome to the National Hispanic and Latino ATTC's webinar, Immigrant Latino Wellbeing. Today's webinar will be presented by Dr. Esther Calzada, and I will tell you a little bit more about her soon. During today's webinar, all participants will be muted. The audio will be streamed through the computer, so please make sure your computer speakers are turned on and up to hear today's presentation. I'm going to review now a few housekeeping items. If you notice that your viewer does not fit your screen, you can expand it by clicking the expand button located in the top right corner indicated by the red arrow right here. Okay? So now you'll see that your viewer is expanded to fit the entire screen. Also, you can collapse the GoToWebinar toolbar on the right of your screen by clicking on the small red arrow to the left of the toolbar right here. And then click the arrow again to expand the toolbar again, and it will expand. For today's webinar, as I said, all participants will be muted. As we move through the presentation, if you have any questions for a presenter, we ask that you use the chat box on the toolbar. You can simply type your question and then hit send. If we have enough questions, we can pause during the presentation to address the questions. Otherwise, we will do that at the end of the presentation. A recording of today's webinar along with the PowerPoint slides will be available at the address, our address that you can see on your screen right now, under webinars and TOTs approximately 1 week from today. You can also find recordings and PowerPoint presentation slides from all our past webinars on the same address. One NADAC, one NBCC, and one ICRC CEU is available to those who attend today's live event. If you're interested in obtaining CEUs from these organizations, you can email us at hispanic@attcnetwork.org. Today's webinar is sponsored by the National Hispanic and Latino ATTC. As of October 1st of 2012, the network has been restructured and now consists of 10 regional ATTCs, 4 national focus areas ATTCs, along with the network coordinating office. As you can see by this map, the ATTC network regions were realigned to better fit the current HHS regions, and the 4 national focus area ATTCs are listed on the left of the screen. Today's webinar is the 8th in a series that the National Hispanic and Latino is offering. As mentioned, the ATTC network is funded by SAMHSA. SAMHSA strives to reduce the impact of substance abuse and mental illness on the United States communities through its programs and services, and demonstrates that behavioral health is essential to health, that prevention works, that treatment is effective, and people recover from mental and substance use disorders. You can learn more about SAMHSA by visiting www.samhsa.gov. So now I'm going to introduce our presenter, Dr. Esther Calzada. Dr. Calzada is an associate professor at the School of Social Work from the University of Texas at Austin. Her major research interests include the role of immigration and acculturation in family processes, developmental changes in parent-child interactions, and behavior disorders in preschool-age children. Dr. Calzada has been principal investigator of an NICHD R01 research that studied family and school context of Latino children as predictors of behavior and socio-emotional problems during early childhood, and an NICHD-K award that studied Latino families of preschoolers using a cultural framework of parenting. In addition, she has received funding from the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, Caring Across Communities initiative to provide culturally informed mental health services to young immigrant Afro-Caribbean students, and federal and state subcontracts to research issues related to the cultural adaptation of evidence-based interventions. Okay. So now we're going to do a series of poll questions so we can get to know our audience. The first question is, are you planning to serve Hispanic and Latino populations with substance use disorders in the next 6 months? So we have 78% of our audience says yes. Okay, we're going to close that question. We're going to go to the second one. Do you currently serve Hispanic and Latino populations with substance use disorders? I'm going to go to that one. Most of our audience, 90%, say yes. What is your current professional role? We have 50% counselors, therapists, 10% administrators, 10% social workers, and others. What type of setting do you currently work in? So we have 60% university, 20% substance use disorders treatment inpatient, and about 29% managed care organizations. Okay, I'm going to close that one. And then our last question, which field of work do you represent? Okay, most of our audience is mental health, about 50%, and then 31% education, and 15% substance use disorders. We're going to close that poll. Thank you, everybody, for answering our questions. And remember that if you have any additional questions during the webinar, you can use the chat box so that we can address those. Now I'm going to have our presenter do the webinar. Here we go. Okay, perfect.
Hi, everybody. I am, sorry, trying to get, is my screen showing?
Yes, we can see it.
Okay, is it on slide?
No, it's
show?
not on slideshow, but
there we
now
go.
it is.
Ah,
All right.
okay.
Thank you.
Great. Well, thank you for having me. I'm very happy to be here today, and I'm going to share some of my thoughts and some of my work on immigrant Latinos and Latino families, and I hope that you will pause and ask questions as needed or reserve them to the end, and maybe we can have some good discussion about what's a pretty complicated topic in my thinking, at least. So it sounds like almost all of you are already working with Latinos, and so I will very briefly go through what's undoubtedly pretty familiar statistics to you all. Latinos in the U.S., we number about 50 million in the U.S. population, which represents about 16%. And we are a very rapidly growing group. Between the 2000 and 2010 census, we accounted for 1/2 of all of the population growth in the United States. We grew at a rate of 43% compared with less than 10% of an overall growth rate. And by 2050, we're projected to number over 132 million and represent about 1/3 of the U.S. population. I think it's also important to know that the Latino population is very young. More than 1 in 5 is under the age of 18, and a great percentage actually under the age of 14. So we're a young, large, and growing population in the United States. We come from many, many, many different countries of origin. Here you see our countries of origin according to the 2010 census. As all of you know, by far the largest subgroup in the U.S. is from Mexico, making up about 2/3 of the entire Latino population. At a distant second is Latinos from Puerto Rico, and then you see other countries of origin listed here. There are definitely variations in which subgroups are the largest depending on the region that you're in the U.S. In New York, where I've done my research, Latinos from Puerto Rico and the Dominican Republic are the largest groups. The fastest growing groups in the U.S., though, are actually from El Salvador and Guatemala. And again, there are regional differences in migration patterns and which groups are growing the fastest. In the New York area, Latinos from Mexico are the fastest growing group. And so not surprisingly, given how many different places we come from, there's tremendous heterogeneity in the Latino population. And this is not only in terms of our country of origin, but also along genetic, historical, social, and cultural dimensions. And this heterogeneity has, for the most part, been ignored by researchers. And so this is one of the great criticisms of the Latino literature in general. And scholars are really starting to emphasize the importance of understanding all these sources of diversity within the larger Latino population. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about two specific subgroups as an illustration of how, as a larger population, we really can differ in many important ways. These are the two groups that I focus on in my own research. The first are Latinos from Mexico. We're all familiar with Mexico, a country of about 113 million. About 10% of Mexicans will leave Mexico to come to the United States. And you saw already the size of the Mexican population in the U.S. Mexico is a country with some racial diversity. The majority of the population is mestizo, which is mixed race, but there's also a sizable indigenous population and a somewhat small but powerful white population as well. Mexico also has some linguistic diversity, and while it's primarily a Spanish-speaking country, there's about 7% of the population that speak indigenous languages and don't speak Spanish. The second group that I focused on in my work are Latinos from the Dominican Republic. As you all know, the Dominican Republic is a Spanish-speaking country in the Caribbean that shares an island with Haiti. It has a population of about 10 million, and there are more than 1 million Dominicans in the U.S. It is also racially diverse, with about 3/4 of the population being mixed race, black and white, and then the remainder of the population being either white or black. And this is an exclusively Spanish-speaking country with no linguistic diversity. So the experiences of Dominicans and Mexicans as two sample groups in migrating to the U.S. can be really, really different. For Dominicans, a relatively typical migration experience can include literally getting on an airplane and flying, most often to New York, where there's a pretty long-standing, well-established Dominican community that is likely to welcome them, that they're likely already connected to in some way. In contrast, the Mexican migration experience can be very different for some. We're all familiar with images of Mexicans trying to cross the border without documentation status, and this is obviously a long, expensive, risky, dangerous journey. It's very different than getting on a plane to come to the United States. Those images have really, oh, I'm sorry. We saw in 2010 about 400,000 Mexicans come into the United States. And while that's a huge, huge number, it's actually quite a significant decline from the mid-2000s. And that decline really is thought to be attributed to the economic recession in the U.S. when the economy was so poor that it really slowed migration from Mexico and Central America. And in making this migration process in 2007, for example, more than 100,000 Mexicans were apprehended at the border. Again, a huge number, but also a significant decrease from really what was the height of immigration, which was in the 90s and in the early 2000s. So all of this has really contributed to an anti-immigrant sentiment in the United States. This is actually a website that is asking concerned Arizona citizens to financially contribute to securing our border. And this is really in spite of the fact that only a third of Mexicans are foreign-born. And the majority, 72% of Mexicans nationally, actually have citizenship status. When you look at Dominicans, more than half are foreign-born, but again, about 70% have their citizenship status. So what does that mean? That means that less than 15% of Dominicans are undocumented, and this translates to about 110,000 people. Now, number-wise, the number of undocumented immigrants from Mexico is huge. 6.5 million Mexicans are undocumented. And Mexicans actually make up, out of all the undocumented immigrants from any country of origin in the U.S., more than half come from Mexico. The Department of Homeland Security in 2010 identified more than 400,000 deportable aliens, and they actually deported about 355,000 of those. This is specific, again, to Mexico as a country of origin. This has obvious, serious repercussions. About half of undocumented immigrants are parents of minors. And so in deporting these undocumented immigrants, the Department of Homeland Security is breaking up families with serious repercussions for the well-being not only of the undocumented immigrant, but also everybody in their family, and particularly their children. So you can see how these kinds of experiences can be very, very traumatic, and there's very little that's known about trauma related to the migration process. It's very hard to study undocumented populations, but what we do know is there's some evidence that Latinos are actually more likely to develop symptoms of PTSD in response to traumatic events. To give you an example, there was a study on the aftermath of Hurricane Andrew, which devastated South Florida, and looking at adult response to the hurricane and mental health and well-being following the hurricane. And what the study found was that more than twice the number of Latinos relative to non-Hispanic whites reported PTSD symptoms following the hurricane. Interestingly, though, these rates were actually attributed to the Spanish-speaking Latinos, because English-speaking Latinos reported rates that were pretty comparable to the non-Hispanic whites. And so what's the explanation for this? It's not necessarily any genetic predisposition to PTSD, but for populations that have experienced past trauma, there's heightened vulnerability for symptoms of PTSD when they experience future trauma. Another explanation is that for Spanish-speaking Latinos, or for more recent Latino immigrants, that cultural values and cultural experiences like fatalism, familismo, and acculturative stress can contribute to experiencing PTSD symptoms or the risk for PTSD symptoms following a trauma. Now, after all of the trauma related to migration, Latinos are often faced with coming to the United States to live in poverty. About 1 in 4 Latinos lives in poverty, and the rates of poverty are highest in the child population. There are more than 6 million Latino children living in poverty in the United States. And during the economic recession from 2000 to 2009, the median household incomes in the Latino population specifically dropped by 66%. And that was fourfold more than the drop experienced by non-Latino whites. So Latinos were disproportionately affected by the economic recession. Latinos often come to receiving communities that are barrios and inner city neighborhoods characterized by considerable poverty and limited social financial resources. Now, in spite of all this, researchers have long found what they call an immigrant paradox. And this is essentially the paradoxical finding that immigrants are generally healthier than their U.S.-born counterparts. So in spite of the increased likelihood of having had trauma and stress related to the migration process and living in poverty, Latino immigrants are healthier. In this quote, it emphasizes how immigrants appear to be immune to some of the injurious health effects related to migration, poverty, racism, discrimination, and other factors that typically affect racial and ethnic minorities in the U.S. So epidemiological studies show us that Latinos have lower overall mortality rates than whites on a lot of major health indicators. And this paradox extends to mental health as well. There's strong support for better mental health among immigrants, especially on disorders that are more sensitive to environmental stressors. So for example, schizophrenia, which is understood to be largely a genetic disorder, may not show the paradox, whereas things like depression, anxiety, substance use, etc., are likely to show the paradox. In a study by Maggie Alegria and her colleagues called the National Latino and Asian American Study, this was the first national representative sample of Latinos and Asian Americans to really focus on these populations in terms of a lot of cultural variables as well as mental health and well-being. They found these rates of substance use, anxiety, and affective disorders. And essentially they looked at what the rates were for recent immigrants, long-term immigrants, and U.S.-born. And you'll see here that for substance use, for example, there's a 10% prevalence rate among recent immigrants for substance use problems, and that rate triples for U.S.-born Latinos. And you see similar patterns for anxiety and affective disorders. And so for any mental health disorder, 50% of U.S.-born Latinos are reporting having experienced a mental health problem, whereas if you're a recent immigrant, that rate is less than 20%. Still a considerable rate, but nothing compared to the U.S.-born rate. This paradox extends to Latino youth. There have been some studies by Clarissa Canino and Hector Bird and their colleagues comparing youth in Puerto Rico with those in the New York area, and found lower rates of conduct disorder, antisocial behavior, and substance use for those living in Puerto Rico, and looked at really what those risk factors are that contribute to these increased rates of disruptive behavior disorders in adolescence for those who are living in the U.S. In some indirect evidence of the immigrant paradox, but kind of along these lines, this is some research that I've been doing on a family intervention called Parent Core. This is an intervention that supports parents and teachers of very young children in raising healthy children. And this was based on a relatively small sample of Latinos. There were between 150 and 200 Latinos in these studies. But we were interested in looking at whether there was a differential response for Latinos based on whether they were immigrant versus U.S.-born to our intervention. And so what you see in this table is what are called effect sizes. The larger an effect size, the larger the impact of the intervention. So you want to see a large effect size here. And if you look, these happen to be academic outcomes, reading achievement, math achievement, parent involvement. You'll see that the effect sizes for immigrants are much larger than the effect sizes for U.S.-born. And we see a similar pattern for English-only versus bilingual Latinos, which is another way, probably a proxy for immigrant status, since later generation Latinos are likely to be English-only. You actually even see for our English-only group that there was a negative effect size on one of our academic outcomes. And so to understand this a little better, we tracked trajectories over time. So we looked at what was happening over time with these families. And what you see here, again, with academic outcomes is the families who were in our control condition, they did not receive the intervention. They're in red, and the Latino families who were part of the intervention are in blue. And if you look at the first two boxes, 3A and 3B, what you see is that the intervention helps bilingual Latino families in the sense that it prevents a deterioration. So if you're a Latino bilingual family, the natural progression for these families was to see a deterioration on these academic outcomes. But if they were part of the intervention, then we essentially helped them to preserve the academic achievement of their children, and there was no deterioration. But if you look at the two boxes on the right, you'll see that basically the trajectories or the patterns over time of the blue and the red families, again, the blue families being the ones who were part of the intervention, the red being the ones that were not, that they're the same, which means that there was really no intervention effect. For Latino families who were English only, likely to be later generation Latino families, we're not seeing an intervention effect for those families. So this makes it especially important for us to understand what's going on for immigrant versus later generation Latino families. So there's been a lot of speculation about what explains the paradox. The first thing is in a recent study that, if you're interested, you should really read. It criticizes the literature for all of the methodological flaws that have characterized past studies. And it really cautions us against making too much of studies that have these methodological flaws. Some primary examples are that we know, for example, that the country of origin matters a lot in these findings. In the study that I mentioned, the National Latino and Asian American study by Maggie Alegria and her colleagues, they found that the immigrant paradox was really specific to Mexicans primarily, and to a much lesser extent, and sometimes not even at all, for Latinos from Cuba and Puerto Rico, for example. And so most past studies have not considered country of origin at all. But recent evidence tells us that we really do need to look at where people come from in order to better understand what's happening. And so that's one reason that it's hard to trust past studies. Another example of a methodological flaw is that undocumented immigrants are very hard to get into our research studies. I think I mentioned that before. So it's very likely that the samples that we're using to draw these conclusions are biased, because the people who are most vulnerable to health problems, that is undocumented immigrants who are likely to be marginalized, to not have health insurance, to not show up in health clinics, etc., that these Latinos are not in our studies. And of course, many of the, as undocumented, those are immigrant Latinos. Still, if we trust the immigrant paradox to some extent, there are some other explanations that we might want to consider for why Latino immigrants are healthier. One explanation is called the healthy immigrant effect, which essentially suggests that it's those individuals who are healthiest, who are most resilient and robust, who actually choose to migrate in the first place. And so Latinos who are in the U.S. kind of represent the healthiest of the healthy, and though that's the reason that we see better health outcomes in Latino immigrants in the U.S. Another explanation is the salmon bias. This essentially refers to the fact that Latinos, immigrants in general, but Latinos in this case, when they experience health problems, and particularly towards the end of their lives, that they're likely to return to their countries of origin, because that is where they want to have experience the end of their life, and that's where they want to die. And so these people are not represented in our studies because they are returning to their countries of origin, and that is biasing the epidemiological results that we're seeing and the prevalence rates that we're seeing for health and mental health outcomes. And probably the explanation that has received the most attention and the most debate is acculturation. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about that and what we know about acculturation in relation to health. So acculturation refers to adapting to your new culture, to the mainstream culture, and this can be in terms of language. It can be in terms of competence, knowledge of traditions, knowledge of behavioral norms and customs, familiarity with the culture, with popular culture, with history and media, and also in terms of the identity, what culture you feel like you identify with. Acculturation goes hand in hand with a process we call enculturation, which is often overlooked but equally important. This is essentially about retaining your culture of origin, retaining your native language, retaining your sense of identity with whatever country that you came from, and maintaining traditions and norms and histories from your original culture. So we know that when immigrants arrive in the U.S. that they go through, to some extent or another, acculturative stress, which refers to kind of the confusion that you have and the anxiety, the feelings of loneliness, and et cetera, that come from being in a brand new place, having left your country, being in a new society, in an unfamiliar society. But it also refers to the behaviors and experiences that happen during that. As you enter this new society and become a part of this new society, you'll have some experiences and develop some behaviors that may be pathological or disruptive. For example, feelings of isolation and marginalization, psychosomatic symptoms that are associated with that process of entering and integrating into a new society. Not surprisingly, this acculturative stress will be highest when the group that you came from and the group that you're entering are different. So the more different those two groups are, those two cultural groups, the greater the acculturative stress. And it's also greatest when there's low tolerance for diversity within your new community. And acculturative stress is highest among recent immigrants, or at least among immigrants who lack the language and the behavioral skills that they need for kind of day-to-day management of life in a new culture. So as people settle, they're going through acculturative stress as they try to become familiar and learn new language, behavior, norms, etc. They're also exposed to significant discrimination in the U.S. 30% of Latinos report experiences of discrimination, and interestingly, the rates are different by immigrant status. So half of U.S.-born Latinos, relative to a quarter of foreign-born Latinos, report feeling discriminated against. And these rates are not believed to reflect actual differences in real discrimination. We think that discrimination happens towards Latinos whether they're U.S.-born or immigrant. What this is believed to reflect is a greater awareness of the discrimination that is in mainstream society as people spend more time in the U.S. That's why U.S.-born Latinos are believed to report higher rates of discrimination. The rates have also been found higher among men and those who are younger, single, better educated, and wealthier. Again, the argument is that the more you are integrated into U.S. society, the more you realize that there in fact is discrimination against the Latino population in the U.S. There are also interesting differences by country of origin, and Cubans are the least likely to report discrimination relative to Latinos from Puerto Rico, Mexico, and other countries. And as you all know, Cubans are a relatively successful, both financially and socially, community in South Florida. And this relative social and economic success integrates them more into U.S. society, again exposing them to more experiences of discrimination, but also within their enclave being protected because it is a somewhat, relative to many of the other groups, a somewhat isolated community that's able to self-sustain kind of on its own. Discrimination comes based on our skin color as a population, on our language use, and quite simply just on our immigrant status. As you saw from, for example, the anti-immigrant, the build the border kind of efforts that we see in the U.S., especially in the Southwest. Studies have shown that darker-skinned Latinos face more discrimination than lighter-skinned Latinos, and so it matters what you look like. It also matters how well you speak English, and Latinos themselves view language, actually, more than any other thing, as the greatest source of discrimination by mainstream society. And these experiences of discrimination matter. They're directly linked to health problems in the general population. And in youth, they're linked to poor academic achievement and aggressive behavior. And studies have found that whether real or perceived, these experiences of discrimination help to explain the relationship between acculturation or time in the United States and health problems. Another explanation for why acculturation or time in the U.S. may erode the health of Latinos or contribute to poor health outcomes among Latinos are behavioral changes. And we see behavioral changes in a lot of different ways as Latinos come to the U.S. and acculturate. One is that we see change in diet. The U.S. is a country of fast food in many ways. It's a country of processed food, of fast, on-the-go kind of meals. And this is not typical of the traditional countries from which Latinos are coming. Now, with globalization, obviously that may be changing to some extent, but the diet can shift radically for Latinos coming from Mexico, for example, and home cooking based on local food sources to coming to the U.S. where both because of poverty and because of the culture of eating where meals become more typically like Subway or McDonald's. There's also behavioral changes in terms of engagement in risky behaviors. There is a theory that's called the segmented assimilation theory, which essentially argues that Latinos, because they are forced into communities of inner city poverty, that as they assimilate or acculturate to U.S. norms and behaviors, that they are actually acculturating to the norms of an inner city, crime-ridden, low social capital, few financial resources, where there's crime, where there's disorganization, where there are broken families, all of the things that often arise from circumstances of poverty, that those are the norms and the behaviors that youth in particular are acculturating to. So this is kind of like, you're being taught how to function within these inner city communities. So these are not the norms necessarily of mainstream U.S. But obviously then those norms involve risky behaviors like skipping school, like substance use, like violence and aggression. And then certainly there's disruption of support networks. Latino culture often is founded on these large extended family networks and even non-kin networks where there are very rich and deep and large families that support each other emotionally, financially, in terms of recreation, in terms of childbearing. And these are disrupted when individuals immigrate, obviously. And so the availability of a support network, the lack of availability of a support network, or the reliance on other immigrants who are in similarly stressful situations changes a lot about how people are able to interact socially and what kinds of opportunities they have for support. So all of these behavioral changes are thought to contribute to the erosion of health and mental health. And then finally, in terms of linking acculturation with poor health, there has been talk about how the erosion of cultural characteristics really can explain this association. This is called the cultural buffer hypothesis, which essentially says that Latino culture, as a traditional culture, buffers us against these stressful life circumstances that as an immigrant and as an ethnic minority population that we're exposed to. And so it buffers us against poor health outcomes, with really the primary focus being on how the centrality of family, which is really true within Latino culture and maybe less true in the U.S., how with the loss of that, then there may be some risk for negative health outcomes. So I'm going to talk a little bit actually about my work, if you'll all indulge me, because this is not work with adults per se, but with mothers and their young children. But I've been really interested in cultural characteristics and cultural values and how those may play a role in child development and in Latino and family well-being in general. We have been working in New York City for about 10 years, or maybe a little less, on these particular studies called Latinos in Context, or LINKS. And we've worked with about 1,000 families at this point. These are Mexican and Dominican families that are recruited when their children are about 4 to 5 years old. And here you see just a little snapshot of what our families look like demographically. This is a largely immigrant population and also a largely low-income population. And so I want to tell you a little bit about our findings. And I'm skipping a lot in terms of what our study does and how we do it, and I'm happy to answer those questions, but I just want to highlight a few findings relevant to thinking about the cultural buffer hypothesis and about cultural values in particular. So we decided to focus on a cultural value that's pretty central to Latinos that's called respeto. Respeto really refers to this notion of authority and obedience and hierarchy, and that children really have the obligation to be respectful and obedient of authority and of adults, of parents and grandparents in particular. This is pretty incongruent with the way that mainstream U.S. culture views children and views how we should raise our children. In mainstream culture, there's much more focus on independence, where this is kind of a child-centric approach of children really being assertive, negotiating, saying what they want, being able to argue for what they want, etc. So we were interested in how respeto and independence might play a role in what parents are doing in terms of their practices in raising their children, and ultimately then how that's related to how their children are doing in terms of externalizing and internalizing problems, but also in terms of academic functioning, which is that bottom circle called the dial. That's a measure of early academic functioning. So what you see here is that respeto, this cultural value that is common in Latino culture, is associated with authoritarian parenting. And quickly, if you're not familiar with the parenting literature, authoritarian parenting is, by mainstream kind of middle-class white U.S. standards, the bad parenting. This is the, kind of I dictate what you do, and there's little warmth in our relationship, and I just kind of tell you what to do, and if you don't do it, I punish you. And in studies with white children and with middle-class families, this is associated with poor child functioning. Authoritative parenting, in contrast, is considered the good parenting. It's also very disciplinarian in the sense that these parents expect a lot, they demand a lot, and they give consequences when those demands are not met. But it's really within the context of warmth. These parents explain why children should do things, etc. And so respeto is associated in our studies with authoritarian parenting and negatively associated with authoritative parenting, and we see the opposite with independence. And then what we see is a link with authoritarian parenting and both externalizing and internalizing problems in kids. And so this tells us a little bit that respeto indirectly actually is a risk factor for children because it's contributing to higher levels of aggression, of anxiety, and of depression. I'll mention a couple things. One is that we looked at our data separately for Dominicans and Mexicans because we think that it's really important to understand how the groups may differ. And the other thing I'll mention is that what you're seeing here are results from what we call a cross-sectional study. This was all at one time. And we weren't sure if these results would be true over time. For example, does respeto make a difference for children, in the long run? And we now have that data, and we are finding similar results with our longitudinal data. I'll add one more path here, which is actually not only did we see that respeto indirectly increased the risk for kids in terms of externalizing and internalizing problems, it also was a risk factor for their early academic functioning. So based on this, we see actually that the preservation of a key Latino cultural value, respeto, may not be such a good idea after all. I'll show you quickly our results with our Mexican families. Here you see the same path from respeto through authoritarian to externalizing and internalizing problems. But we see different results in some ways. Respeto is not linked directly to the dial, which is, again, the early academic functioning test. Instead, we see that independence actually is a good thing for Mexican kids only in terms of promoting how they're doing academically in these early years. At the same time, independence actually is associated with more externalizing problems like disobedience and aggression in the classroom, where you see a P versus a T means parent versus teacher, although I just saw typo. Okay, so that tells us a little bit that we should be wary of at least some aspects of this cultural buffer hypothesis, of the preservation of Latino culture. And what we're starting to think and what we're starting to find with our data is evidence for what we call moderation, which is that things may be different depending on who you are. For example, are you Mexican versus Dominican? Are you a boy versus a girl? So here's an example of moderation. This is a study with ethnic identity. This is the same sample of our kids that I showed you before with links. And we looked at how their ethnic identity might be related to how they're doing. And what we found is that ethnic identity was protective for internalizing problems, but only for Dominican kids, not for Mexican kids. In ways we don't fully understand, but again, suggesting to us that these cultural variables may mean different things depending on who you are. We've also done some work on familismo. Familismo, probably out of all of the kind of cultural characteristics of the Latino culture, has received the most attention in the research literature. It's this emphasis on family, the centrality of family, reliance on family. There is a lot of literature that suggests familismo is protective and that it's one of the reasons, if not a primary reason, that Latinos who hold this cultural value more strongly are healthier and fare better in numerous ways. But here we find that that's only true for some people. So if you look on the right with the boys versus girls, we see a protective effect only for our boys. So that is, high familismo is protective for boys in that they have better adaptive behavior. And adaptive behavior includes things like social skills, leadership, adaptability, being able to be flexible, etc. Familismo is protective only for boys. If you look at the figure on the left, what you actually see is familismo as risk. And that is within the context of poverty. So our whole sample was low income, but we characterized those that were more extreme poverty by federal poverty guidelines, being above the 200% threshold. And that those families living in poverty, high familismo actually was a risk factor, at least in terms, specifically in terms of their adaptive behavior. And so the picture really starts to get complicated about these cultural values and what they mean. I'll give you another example based on a qualitative study that we did. This was a study, again of a different study, but again of Mexican, Dominican, and Puerto Rican families in the New York City area. It was an ethnographic study where field workers went out and spent time with and interviewed families. And here's an example of how familismo may actually be risky for a family. And in this snippet, which I won't read, basically there's a mother who's saying that her husband's cousin is in the house, but he's doing drugs. And for a while, the backstory is that she's been kind of torn because he contributes to the rent, and financially she really needs that support. On the other hand, she knows that he's doing drugs. She's warned him about that in the presence of her family and her children, and he continues to do drugs. So you can see how her feeling of obligation to allow this cousin to come and live in her home because he doesn't, he recently arrived. This is a Mexican family in this case. He recently arrived from Mexico and he needs a place to live. Her sense of obligation to fulfill that need for him, to help him with that need, is really causing her conflict because she's also seeing this risk that he's introducing into her family. Now, this happens to be a family with young children, and I think that's also important to consider because it would be a very different story potentially for this family if the children in this home were teenagers, for example. In this case, the children are very young. They're 5 and under. And so you can also see how familismo may be risky for a family, also depending on where they are in their development. So I think that if we think of that all together, we're left with, and I'm sorry to leave you with more questions than answers. That's often true in our research. What we do know is that as immigrant Latinos and even later generation Latinos, our task is to successfully adapt to mainstream U.S. culture. And our task is simultaneously to retain important aspects of our original culture. But really the question is, what aspects should be retained or what aspects should be adapted to? And for what outcomes does it matter? Does it matter for substance use versus depression versus anxiety versus antisocial behavior versus high school completion? For what individuals? Does it matter for if you're Cuban versus Puerto Rican versus Mexican versus Dominican? Does it matter where we're living? Does it matter if we're in the Bronx in an inner city community versus Arizona? Does it matter if we're in South Florida versus Minnesota? And at what point? Does it matter if we're 3 versus if we're 13? All of these contextual characteristics have yet to really be fully understood and is really what we need to work towards. So I'm going to end with a couple of thoughts on intervention. I haven't done clinical work in a number of years, but that's kind of always where my heart lies. And I think, one of the implications in my mind of what we know so far about Latinos and mental health and immigration and acculturation is that cultural humility is one thing that can be incredibly helpful to us in our services to Latinos. This is a concept from the literature that essentially refers to the fact that regardless of what we know of Latinos as a population, of the Latino culture, based on our own professional or personal experiences as Latinos, is that we should always take a one-down position in a clinical encounter, in a service provider encounter, to learn from that person, from that family, about their culture, about their experiences, about their values and their norms and their traditions, and about how those things are playing a role in their lives, the meaning they have in their lives, the impact that they're having. And we're not used to, clinically, we're not used to taking a one-down position. We're not used to necessarily thinking, past our assessment point, what are we going to learn from our client? But this is about really making this part of the process. It's about being humble about essentially what we don't know about culture and allowing that be a partnership with our clients so that we can figure it out together. So a related idea is really thinking about biculturalism and how this can be really a promising approach to successful adaptation. We know that as Latinos, we need to learn how to speak English so that we have more opportunities. We need to learn how to function successfully within mainstream culture so that we can have more opportunities. At the same time, we know it's important to preserve our value of family and to preserve other values that have a long history in the Latino culture. And thinking about how to really merge two cultures within the context of that individual client or family, I think is really important. And rather than saying, oh, it's important for you to be familistic, we know that that's important, to really explore whether that really is important, in what ways, and what impact it has on that individual person or family's life. So I will stop there. Thank you for listening, and if you have any questions, I'm happy to talk more.
Thank you, Dr. Calzada. That was excellent. We're going to change the screen now. Okay, great. Um, we have a few questions. The first one is, do you think that children of immigrant Latino families coming to the U.S. will be more likely to identify as Americans rather than as from their country of origin?
That's a good question. That's a great question. There's actually a number of research studies looking at this, and I can't speak to any specific findings, so I'll kind of talk generally. The interest is in looking at the labels that kids use, why they use them, and whether that's related to their well-being. And we certainly know that the longer that you're in the U.S., the more likely you are to call yourself American, for example. And it might be a hyphenated label that you use, for example, Dominican American, or you might just start calling yourself American. And that depends a lot also on your context. So, for example, if you're in the Bronx in the middle of a large Dominican community, you probably don't feel very American, even if you've been there all your life. So in contrast to me, for example, I was raised in a town that had, maybe one or two other Dominican families, and so my identity very easily became that of Dominican American. So the context really matters a lot, and what we don't fully understand is also what implication does that have, what your label is. We know a little bit that ethnic identity, or how you label yourself, is in general a good thing to have an ethnic label. It can be associated with a higher self-esteem and with better mental health outcomes. But it's also kind of tricky because it depends on your context. It might be better for self-esteem, but not necessarily better for your academic performance, for example.
Okay, thank you. We have another question. Could you elaborate a little bit more on the difference between acculturation and enculturation?
Sure. So I'll start just by saying that most people, both in kind of the lay population and in the research population, they talk about acculturation and they mean kind of the whole bag, everything related to coming into a new culture and adapting. So they mean both acculturation and enculturation. The term acculturation often refers to both, but technically they're two different things. Acculturation is the process of adapting to your new culture. So you are learning a new language, for example. You are learning that in the U.S. people are on time. Those kinds of things, right? So that's acculturation. Enculturation is really about preservation or retaining that culture that you already have. Now, in later generations, enculturation can actually be what's harder because you have, maintaining Spanish if you're third generation Latino, for example, is tough. But so an easy way to think about it is enculturation is about your culture of origin, about being Latino, and acculturation is about being American, being U.S. American.
Okay, great. We don't have a lot of time, so I'm going to do one more question, and then I want to let the audience know that what we do is that we post the answers to these questions along with the recording of the presentation so you can access them later. I know you mentioned that you weren't doing clinical work recently, but one question is, do you have a recommendation for families where children and parents are at different rates of acculturation and this is creating, for example, communication problems?
Yes, that's a great question. This is called differential acculturation, or the acculturation gap, and it's really been studied a lot in the literature and linked to family conflict and in many cases negative outcomes. We know that kids acculturate more quickly, typically, than parents or grandparents, and that this leads to a whole host of problems. There's a whole intervention program developed by folks in Miami that is about bicultural effectiveness training, which is essentially about teaching the kids to understand the parents, so in other words, to understand Latino culture, and teaching parents to understand American culture and finding middle ground there. I'm not sure we really have time to go too much into that, but I think the point is, yes, that's an important place to go clinically, I think, and to really target where youth and parents are not understanding each other from a cultural perspective and how they can come to that place. So a quick example might be an innocuous quick example might be a sleepover. Latino parents don't usually do sleepovers with the classmate, right? But the kids, you know, that's the norm in their culture. And so really that might be a focus of discussion of, you know, where are we going to meet here? What middle ground are we going to come to here now that this is not part of our original culture, but it's part of our new culture? And there will be some things that Latino parents say, no matter what, I'm not going to change on this, and some places where the flexibility needs to be there.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. So again, I'd like to take a moment to thank you. I think this was an excellent presentation. We really appreciate your time. And for the audience, just a reminder, a recording of today's webinar along with the PowerPoint slides will be posted and available at our website. And you have the address right here on your screen under webinars and TOTs. So this concludes today's webinars. Please look at our website to learn about our future events. And as you leave today's webinar, you'll be directed to complete a brief survey about your experience. Your feedback is very important to us, and we appreciate you taking the time to tell us what you thought of today's webinar. So thank you, everybody, and have a great Christmas.